In this lecture, we will survey a complete Dead Sea Scroll text, namely the Community Rule. When this text was first published, scholars were wont to call it in English the Manual of Discipline, though nowadays the term Community Rule is more in vogue. The Hebrew name is Serach HaYachad, with Yachad being the Dead Sea Scroll sect's self-designation. Serach, rule, Yachad, community, the rule of the community, or the Community Rule. Upon reading this scroll, scholars saw immediately that the beliefs and practices presented in this text diverged from the mainstream rabbinic Judaism of the times, though we will return to the issue of mainstream anything later on in our course. Moreover, some of these beliefs and practices correspond to those of the Essenes, whom we have already mentioned in our course, including the use of initiation rites to become a member of the group, the pooling of financial resources, and the eating of communal meals. And it was for all of these reasons that the Community Rule was such a prime text for scholars when they first began to read the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the late 1940s. No other text provides so much information about the nature of the sect, its beliefs, and its practices as the Community Rule. And so as we move into this part of our course, I elect to begin reading a Dead Sea Scroll by choosing the Community Rule as the document to read with you. The Community Rule consists of 11 columns, and therefore it's a relatively long text, well preserved, and it divides into the following 5 sections. An introduction, columns 1 and 2, and the first half of column 3, with an emphasis on the community, the Yachad, and the covenant that exists between God and this group of people. Next, the second section is called the Tractate on the Two Spirits, taking up the rest of column 3 and all of column 4. This section of the text presents some of the dogmas and doctrines of the community, including the dualism that is inherent in the Dead Sea Scrolls sect. More on that in a moment. Next is the largest section of the Community Rule, the statutes, comprising columns 5, 6, 7, 8, and half of column 9. A series of laws that governs the sect, including its communal lifestyle, its organization, its leadership, and so on. The fourth part of the Community Rule is a small section, the second part of column 9 and the beginning of column 10, called the Rules for the Master, and these include various rules which are specific to the leader of the community. And finally, most of column 10 and all of column 11 is the Hymn of the Master, a poem in the first person as the Master addresses God in a series of prayers and requests of the deity. We begin by looking at the introduction to the Community Rule, and we will start and focus most of all on a series of texts that appear in column 1. The first text I want to read with you is column 1, lines 9 and 10, which states as follows. The community members are to, quote, love all the sons of light, each according to his lot in the counsel of God, and to hate all the sons of darkness, each according to his guilt with the vengeance of God. First, we note that the same phrases are used in the War Scroll. Earlier in our course, we saw that the words sons of light and sons of darkness are used in the War Scroll, and here they appear as well in the Community Rule. This was an important linkage for scholars as they began to read the Dead Sea Scrolls in those early years of Qumran scholarship, because it showed that this was not a haphazard collection of documents, but the same phrases that were used in text A are also used in text B. And so the group of Dead Sea Scrolls together came to be seen, correctly so, as a collection of documents written by the same people with a singular purpose. Now, the Sons of Light refers to members of the sect, while the Sons of Darkness, we gather, refers to other Jews, other Jewish groups, and we've talked about the variegated Jewish life at this time. You may ask, what about non-Jews? What about pagans and polytheists, the Greeks and the Romans, etc.? Well, apparently they are beyond even talking about. So when you hear the expression Sons of Light, we're talking about the sect itself. The sect uses that term to refer to their own, and the Sons of Darkness refers to other Jews. Those are their enemies, and the people on the beyond the Jewish umbrella, Greeks and Romans and so on, are not part of the discussion of this text or of the other texts usually found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Finally, on this passage, one notes the vitriol, quote, with the vengeance of God. This typifies religious sects who see themselves an oppressed minority. They very often see themselves besieged in this way, and thus they need to fight back, and the way to fight back is with strong words. With the vengeance of God, you were supposed to hate the sons of darkness. A few lines later in column 1, lines 11 and 12, we have the following passage. And all who volunteer for his truth, his referring to God, and all who volunteer for his truth shall bring all their knowledge and their strength and their wealth into the Yachad of God, the Yachad, the community. First, we note that people volunteer to be members of the group. Secondly, more importantly, we note that they contribute their wealth to the group, thereby pooling their resources. Now, Josephus refers to the Essenes' communal pooling of wealth. And we also noted that this was in the passage of Pliny the Elder that we quoted in our very first lecture. And so you begin to see here a linkage between the Dead Sea Scrolls' own documents, that they are supposed to volunteer with all of their wealth, and the descriptions of the Essenes in our ancient sources, most importantly Josephus, who talks about the Essenes' communal lifestyle and the pooling of their wealth. Another text in column 1, another couple of lines below, lines 13 and 14. The members of the sect are told, quote, not to deviate in the smallest detail from any of the words of God. Now, this is probably something that all Jews would have agreed to. No one would want to deviate from the Word of God, as laid out in the Torah and the other books of the Bible. But it is emphasized here in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and much more so here than in other Jewish writings. Josephus informs us that the Essenes were the strictest observers of Jewish law. And so when you see a text such as this, that one should not deviate from even the smallest detail of God's Word, you can begin to connect this text once more with Josephus' description of the Essenes. We're going to talk about the Jewish sects in greater detail in a future lecture. In a previous lecture, I referred to the Essenes along with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We'll lay out all those differences and contrasts and comparisons between and among the sects. But already now, as you can see, I need to present to you some basic information about the Essenes as detailed by Josephus and Philo and to some extent Pliny, so that we can begin to see how the community rule as a paradigmatic Qumran document fits into the Essene hypothesis. Later on in column 1, again another line or two below, we read that the community is, quote, not to advance their holy times and not to postpone any of their festivals. Let me repeat that. Not to advance their holy times and not to postpone any of their festivals. When you see a prohibition such as this, you can be certain that there are people who are actually doing this. Now, here I need to provide for you a large amount of background material to make you understand what's important about this passage. Let me try to explain it in the following way. We know from the rabbinic practice, and we know from the rabbis' own texts, that they would adjust the calendar to make sure that the holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, never fell on a Friday or a Sunday. And they needed to do that for the following reason. As everyone is aware, the Sabbath falls on the seventh day of the week. And the Bible in the Torah lays out various laws concerning the Sabbath. Among the things one cannot do, one cannot work, and one cannot kindle a fire. And as we know from the Jewish tradition, all Jews would have agreed on this, one cannot cook on the Sabbath. After all, it requires a lighted fire to cook. And therefore, Sabbath preparation, or the preparation of food, in particular cooked food, had to occur on Friday in advance of the Sabbath. Now, what would happen if Yom Kippur fell on a Friday? Think, if it helps you for a moment, to consider the Christian calendar, especially the holiday of Christmas. if that helps you here, because Christmas can fall on any day of the week as it migrates with a particular date, December 25th. From year to year, it could fall on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So what happens, and that's true of the Jewish holidays as well, what happens when Yom Kippur falls on a Friday? Now, the problem is that the rules of Sabbath apply to the Day of Atonement as well. The Torah refers to this day as equal to a Sabbath. Therefore, anything that you can't do on the Sabbath, you also cannot do on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, such as cooking. What happens if you need to prepare your Sabbath-cooked food on Friday and Yom Kippur is on a Friday? It creates a difficulty, and therefore, as we know from rabbinic sources, the rabbis tweaked the calendar, I'll explain how in just a moment, to make sure that Yom Kippur could never fall on a Friday. Now, what happens if Yom Kippur is going to fall on a Sunday? What's the problem? Well, here you have a slightly different problem. Because Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is a fast day, one needs to fast for 24 hours. One needs to eat a major meal of cooked food in advance of the fast, which will happen in the late afternoon hours before sunset on the Day of Atonement. So if Yom Kippur is a Sunday, the previous day is the Sabbath, and you have the problem in a different direction. That is to say, you cannot now prepare your major meal before the fast of cooking food because it's the Sabbath day. This is a complicated subject. I hope I've laid out the problems for you. So what did the rabbis do? They ensured that Yom Kippur would never fall on a Friday or a Sunday. How did they do that? If the Torah states, which it does very clearly in the book of Leviticus and elsewhere, that this holiday will fall on month 7, day 10, how does one deal with the problem of the calendar? You can't change what the Torah says. What you can do, however, is tweak the beginning of the month, and that's what the rabbis would do. They would assure that the sighting of the new moon occurred at a particular time, or that there was a 2-day new moon festival that month instead of a 1-day new moon. And so they would make sure that the holiday of the Day of Atonement did not fall on a Friday or a Sunday. It actually could fall on a Saturday and override the Sabbath, but they ensured that it would never fall on a Friday or a Sunday. Therefore, the Qumran community, in opposition to what other Jews were doing, states in column 1 of this text not to advance the holy times and not to postpone any of the festivals. And by moving the Day of Atonement artificially from a Friday to a Saturday, you are postponing it, or moving it from a Sunday to a Saturday, you are advancing it. And this was something which the Dead Sea Scroll community opposed in this text. A lot of background material to explain to you that single passage from column 1 of the community rule. A few lines further down, still in column 1, lines 16 and 17, we read, "All who enter the rule of the Yachad shall be initiated into the covenant before God to do according to all that he has commanded, and not to backslide because of any fear or terror." Now the text goes on to speak of the initiates being inducted into the covenant. And there is a ceremony which takes place in which the priests and the Levites bless God, and the initiates respond, Amen, Amen. Now Josephus, once more, is very informative here because he describes initiation rites that the Essene community partook in. No other Jewish community did this, but people volunteered to become members of this group and went through an initiation period with these rituals. Essenes of Josephus' description, initiation rites, community rule, column 1, initiation rites. We have another nexus between the Dead Sea Scrolls sect and the Essenes. The second section of the community rule, as I mentioned, is the tractate of the two spirits, second half of column 3 and all of column 4. This section of the document presents the essential dualism of the sect, and it speaks about predestination. Let's look at each of those items now. Dualism. In the mindset of the Qumran community, God has created a spirit of light and a spirit of darkness and placed each in each person. And the world is governed by entities who are referred to, alongside God, as the Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness. Both of these terms are very reminiscent of Zoroastrian terminology. Zoroastrianism was the religion of ancient Persia, and its most characteristic trait was dualism. There were many religions of antiquity which were polytheistic, and of course Judaism developed as a monotheism. The Persian religion is somewhere in between. It countenances two deities, therefore we call it a dualism. The god of good, Ahura Mazda, and the god of evil, Angra Mainyu. And they see these two forces, these two entities, always in battle, in conflict with one another. And Zoroastrianism influenced other ancient religions, including Judaism, at least the brand of Judaism reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where this dualism is spoken of in very, very clear terms. And then there is similar influence from Zoroastrianism on early Christianity. So this trait of dualism is central to the Dead Sea Scroll community. It is right here in column 3 of the community rule. The same column 3, just a few lines further down, gives us the clearest expression in any Dead Sea Scroll of the notion of predetermination or predestination. Let me read for you this text from column 3, lines 15 and 16. From the God of knowledge comes all that is and all that shall be. Before things come to be, he has prepared all their thoughts, so that when they do come to be at their appointed times, according to his glorious plan, they fulfill their action, a destiny impossible to change. One could hardly ask for a clearer statement of predetermination or predestination. All of this reminds us of Josephus' statement that the Essenes denied free will and relied solely on the doctrine of predetermination or predestination. Once more, in a future lecture, when we talk about the sects in greater detail, we'll lay out the differences between and among Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes concerning this very important doctrinal difference. But for here, you can see the predetermination of the Dead Sea Scroll community is spoken of in very, very clear terms. All that is and all that ever will be, God has set in motion, and it is a destiny that cannot be changed. We now move to the next section of the community rule, and that's the largest section in the middle, the section of the statutes. These are rules which govern the community. At the beginning of the statutes section, column 5, line 2, we have a reference to the supervision of the sect by the priests. And the priests here are called the sons of Zadok, or to use the Hebrew pronunciation, the sons of Tzadok. Zadok was the high priest of the first temple when Solomon first constructed it. He lived during the reigns of David and Solomon, and he was the high priest in the temple when it was first constructed. So that the term sons of Zadok is used by later Jews as if this meant the authentic priests, and it suggests that there is some debate here between this group and another group who may have seen the priests coming from a different priestly line. Regardless, this passage demonstrates an emphasis on the priesthood, and this has led some scholars to suggest a link with the Sadducees, because the name Sadducees derives from this very word Zadok, or Hebrew Tzadok. In truth, very few scholars adhere to this view, but we will return to it in a later lecture in our course. The last line of the statute section, which is column 9, verse 11, has the following to say. It refers to, quote, the coming of the prophet and the messiahs, plural, and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. A key passage with two messiahs mentioned here, a messiah of Aaron and a messiah of Israel. Now, you can see why this fascinated scholars. Scholars were just fascinated by this text time and time again. This passage coming near the end of the community rule, most important of all. All of the Jews of antiquity would have agreed that there was a Messiah of Israel. That is to say, on the national level, the people of Israel awaited the coming of a Messiah who in their theology was a descendant of King David, who would restore kingship and glory to the people of Israel and lead the world into the Messianic age. What you see nowhere else, however, is a reference to the Messiah of Aaron. This suggests that alongside the Davidic kingly or royal Messiah, there is also a priestly Messiah, Aaron was the first high priest going back to the earliest time of Israel as the brother of Moses, and his investiture as high priest, along with his sons, is described for us in the Torah, in the books of Leviticus and in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. So here you have something unique to Jewish life that we did not know of before the Dead Sea Scrolls, a group that believes not only in the Messiah of Israel, that is to say the Davidic Messiah, but also a priestly Messiah, the Messiah of Aaron. So there's an emphasis on priesthood here, as we noted at the beginning of the statute section with the reference to the sons of Zadok, and at the end of the statute section with the reference to a Messiah of Aaron. A key passage in the statute section is column 6, lines 2 and 3. Very briefly, very succinct language. Together they shall eat, together they shall bless, that is pray, and together they shall advise. Here we see the communal aspects of the group in the clearest of terms. And once more we note a linkage, because Josephus notes that the Essenes lived a communal lifestyle. And so when this document refers to the group as eating together and praying together and deliberating together, that is a clear connection to the Essene group as described by Josephus. The statute section also includes punishment by confinement for various offenses in column 7. We don't know where this confinement would have taken place. Did they have a small jail cell on the site? We simply don't know. But what we do see in this text is taking their responsibilities very seriously, their responsibilities to the community as a whole. Let me give you some examples of why one would be punished by the Qumran community. For speaking foolishly, that gets you 3 months. Interrupting another community member while speaking, that gets you 10 days. Falling asleep during a meeting, 3 months. Exposing one's nakedness in public, that's a more serious offense. That carries a punishment of 6 months confinement. And spitting during a meeting, don't do that or you'll get 30 days in confinement. Here I would like to share with you one of the contributions I have made to Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. Another passage in column 7 in this list of offenses occurs in line 15. And it states, "He who draws out his left hand, lasuach with it, he shall be punished 10 days. Most translations render the verb to gesticulate, but this leaves unanswered why only the left hand. I, in a scholarly article that I published in 1989, investigated this rare verb, lasuach, a Hebrew verb, which also occurs in the Bible on several occasions, and I determined that the word actually means to urinate, perhaps also to defecate. And then, as I said, I published the results of my study in 1989. In addition, I showed how rabbinic texts refer to the use of the left hand for purposes of excretion. And that's why this Dead Sea Scroll text refers specifically to the left hand, and that the word lasuach must mean excrete, defecate, urinate, something in that semantic field, and not gesticulate, because it would leave unexplained why only the left hand. My little contribution to the world of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. I will refer to a few other items that I have contributed as our course proceeds through its end. The community rule refers to ritual immersion in a number of places, though this would have been practiced by all Jews in antiquity. And here once more I need to give you a good amount of background information what this entails. In the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, chapters 12 through 15, and also in Numbers chapter 19, we have references to what we call ritual impurity. Now, what is ritual purity and what is ritual impurity? According to the Jewish system, as laid out in the Torah, a person is born in a state of ritual purity. Certain actions or states can move you, however, into the state of ritual impurity. And these include, for example, childbirth, which obviously affects only women, various skin diseases, genital flows, such as menstruation for women, or signs of blood not at the time of their menstruation, and for men, nocturnal emissions of semen. And most importantly also, as discussed in Numbers chapter 19, contact with the dead, what we might call corpse impurity, the most serious type of ritual impurity. And then the Torah goes on to describe how you remove your ritual impurity, and it usually entails a waiting period, bathing, ritual immersion, and then a sacrifice that occurs in which you are, upon which you are returned to the state of ritual purity. Now you will notice that these have nothing to do with sin. For example, giving birth to a child is the fulfillment of a commandment. The first commandment that God gives to the first human couple is to be fruitful and multiply, and nevertheless, a woman giving birth is rendered at this point impure. Or burying the dead. This renders you impure because you've obviously have had to come in contact with a corpse, and yet this is one of the greatest things you can do, a great deed that you can do for another human being, is to provide the proper burial rituals and funerary practices which the society expected and demanded. And yet that too renders you impure. So this has nothing whatsoever to do with sin in the system that the Bible sets up. But when we come to our Dead Sea Scrolls community, however, all of a sudden we see something very, very different. Because in the statute section of the community rule, we are told that no one can enter the water, or I should say one must enter the water, before one can touch the purity, that is the pure food of the men of holiness. For they shall not be purified until they turn from their wickedness. For he is impure among all who transgress his word. Now let's break down this passage and explain exactly what is entailed in this particular case. One needed to be in a state of purity before one could enter the temple and eat of the pure food, right? You had priests who were offering sacrifices in the temple, and they, of course, had to be very diligent in observing the laws of ritual purity, but so did anyone who wanted to enter into the temple. And only then could you eat of the sacrifices. If you were in a state of ritual impurity, one could not do that. The Dead Sea Scrolls passage indicates that ritual bathing, ritual immersion, however, removes not only ritual impurity, which the Bible discusses, but that it also removes sin and transgression, and that one had to do this before one could eat of the holy food. Now, as we will see, the Qumran community, as we'll see in future lectures, the Qumran community actually did not participate in the rituals in the temple because they considered the entire temple complex to be polluted and impure since it was in the hands of other Jewish groups. But in their ideal, in their model, they believed that you still had holy food, you still had food that was as if it were sacrificial food in the temple, and most likely all the food they ate in their community, in their own little sacred space that they had created, was of this type. Before you could eat such food, however, you had to ritually immerse to remove not only ritual impurity, but also sin and transgression. This is a whole new feature of Jewish life that we don't get from our other sources, which we do get in the community rule and in other Dead Sea Scroll documents. Taken together, these items are paralleled in the New Testament in the following way. And here, for the first time, we provide for you a nexus between the Dead Sea Scrolls community and the books of the New Testament. Consider, for example, what one reads at the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark in chapter 1, verse 4. And so John came, John the Baptist, and so John came, baptizing in the desert region and preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And in Matthew chapter 3, verse 6, confessing their sins, they were baptized by him in the Jordan River. Again, if you go back to the biblical books of the Torah, where this is laid out in Leviticus and Numbers, the baptism, the immersion, the ritual bathing has nothing to do with sin. It only has to do with the removal of ritual impurity, which is brought on by things which are not sinful, things beyond your control, like menstruation or an accidental emission of semen. And yet the Qumran community and the early Christian community have in common here that you can use this act of immersion in a body of water not only for the removal of ritual impurity, but also for the removal of sin. In the community rule, there are no references to women. This point confirmed for many interpreters of this text that the sect, the Dead Sea Scroll community, was celibate. And thus we have another linkage here to the Essenes, especially in light of the Pliny text, which we quoted earlier, and also Philo and Josephus, in their description of the Essenes, tell us that some Essenes were celibate. Celibacy among the Essenes, or some of the Essenes, and the lack of any references to women in the community rule made the connection between this community and the Essenes firmer again. We do have to say, however, that this is qualified by the fact that another important document, which we will look at in a future lecture, called the Damascus document, and other texts as well, do refer to women, so one can only take this to an extent, but nevertheless, the point is made here by certain scholars early on in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, connecting the lack of references to women in our community rule with the celibacy of some Essenes as revealed in our ancient sources. One wonders, of course, whether other Jewish sects of the time also possessed documents such as this one. That is, their own community rules. But of course, we have no way of knowing. Most likely, though, the answer is no, since the communal nature of the Essenes would have demanded such a document in a way that the Sadducee or Pharisee lifestyles would not have demanded, and therefore we probably do not have such documents from those groups, and it is only from this group with its Essene connections that one sees a text like the community rule. As a final note, I want to say another word about the term yachad. As I have stated, this is the term that the sect itself uses to refer to its own community. And scholars in turn have adopted this term, yachad, to refer to the sect in their own modern scholarly writings. This is especially true of those scholars who do not admit to the Essene identity of the sect, because if you call them only the Yachad, you're using an objective self-designation without biasing which group this particular Yachad or community may have belonged to. But it is even true of those scholars such as myself who do identify the Qumran community with the Essenes, and in our course we shall follow suit, so that at times, sometimes simply for the sake of variety, I will use the term Yachad to refer to the Qumran community.